Today, we welcome Bo Sandoval, Director of Strength Conditioning at UFC Performance Institute. At UFCPI, Bo works with some of the world's top MMA fighters and plays an integral role in the continued development of performance, welfare, and research for the sport. Prior to his role at UFCPI, Bo has developed training programs for several NCAA champions, national champions, Paralympians, and Olympians in a multitude of sports. Bo has the unique ability to use some of the most advanced sport technologies in the world to provide a training protocol based in science and data. His studies and experience make him a leader in the field, and we are extremely excited to dive into that knowledge today. So thanks, Bo, for taking the time. I know you've had an active evening, so thanks so much for carving out some time for us. I appreciate it.
Man, thank you for that warm welcome. I'm definitely looking forward to the conversation. Thank you guys for having me.
You bet. So I guess my first question is kind of how did you get to the position that you're at currently?
Sure. So just to give you the short version, early in my career, 2006 to 2009, I was at the U.S. Olympic Committee in Colorado Springs as an S&C coordinator. And when I first arrived, I was kind of used as a utility position, helping out with a multitude of different sports and different genres. And quickly kind of carved my way into the acrobat and combat portfolio. So that's where my deep dive into wrestling, boxing, taekwondo, judo, and fencing kind of took off. Not only getting familiar with combative sports, but also getting familiar with weight classification sports. And so later on, that would play a role in not only preparing me, but kind of building my portfolio to make me an eligible candidate when they went into the recruitment process for the UFC. What was that? Almost 10 years later. So that's the short version. Been an S&C, started my S&C journey in 2000 as an intern at the University of Southern Mississippi as a freshman, and interned my entire 4 years of undergraduate there. I learned kind of early on when I figured out that that was a profession and that was a thing, a service that was being provided to collegiate athletes. I wanted to get involved in it. I was already kind of sniffing around the athletic training fields and the physical therapy fields. Made a pretty quick decision early on that I wanted to work with healthy athletes more often than the injured ones. That seemed to be more of my forte. So after undergrad, I had built enough rapport for myself and established myself enough. I was, I guess, ballsy enough to go in and ask and apply for a graduate assistant position at Southern Miss. Did 2 years of graduate school in exercise phys there, and then moved on to a role in Jackson, Mississippi, at a small NAIA Presbyterian school that did not have a strength and conditioning department, had a pretty new weight room, needed a little bit of remodeling, but I kind of took that on. 24 years old, not married, kind of one of those jobs where you work, from dusk till dawn, 7 days a week. And I think I made like $24,000 a year.
You worked dusk till dawn, so you worked like an overnight shift?
Overnight. I mean, they picked me up on Sundays because it was a Presbyterian rule. They were like, you can't work on Sunday. You can come to chapel, but that's about it. I kind of had to work around that because I had 14 sports I was supporting there. Mm-hmm. So to get it all in, you had to be there. So, but it was a great time. Cut my teeth, obviously, in the profession there, learn how to build relationships. Every coach that was there was older than me, more established than me, a lot more experience. So it was a great time to kind of feed off the knowledge of others. And we had a couple of Hall of Fame coaches that were there that had been coaching for close to 40 years at the time. So I took advantage of that before moving on to the Olympic Committee. In 2009, I left the Olympic Committee and went to the University of Michigan with Olympic sports there to assist a colleague of mine in building a formal Olympic sports program. At the University of Michigan, with someone with an institution with a budget that massive and 32 Olympic sports, they actually didn't have a program really set up for those sports. They had 3 full-time strength coaches that were working across all sports, including football, basketball, hockey. were their big revenue generators. And so at that point, they were looking to make an investment in their other sports that were there. So over the next 8 years, we built a team of 3 into a team of 11 and added 2 additional facilities there. That was a really fruitful time in my professional experience, not only from the S&C side and developing, abilities around coaching and program development, and long-term program development. That's something that I think was really beneficial. 8 years of involvement, seeing a couple different cycles of classes go through from freshman to their senior, and some of them into postgraduate competition. But also the management experience, going from managing a couple of interns when we got there to managing upwards of 9 full-time assistants later on as I moved up into an assistant director role. And then, we were kind of set. Me and my wife at the time, we had one little boy. We were super comfy. We were thinking we were just staying in Ann Arbor for a while. Started building a place and graduating from our single family home, and found us 5 acres in the middle of nowhere. And that was going to be our spot. And then the UFC sent an email to me halfway through that process and threw us for a loop. So we were pretty cautious. We didn't know anything about Vegas. We didn't know anything about the UFC. They had never done high performance before. So I was a little bit skeptical in what their investment and approach was going to be to providing health and welfare benefits to their professional athletes. As well as our firstborn is on the autism spectrum. So we had great resources in Michigan. Everything we had researched, there were pretty limited resources in Vegas. So luckily throughout the process, we met some key people that helped us kind of get our feet wet in that space and get comfortable with some of the suburban areas around. All we know about Vegas is the Strip, and we don't gamble. We don't do too much of that. So there needed to be some other interest. Come to find out, it's a pretty awesome place to be if you like the outdoors, both on the adventure side and the hunting and fishing side. So there's a lot of things to get into there. And it was enough to entice us. So we competed for the opportunity, jumped on it, and we're creeping up on 4 years now that we've been here in Vegas. There you go. There's the spiel.
And that's awesome. All the time we have. So thanks for coming.
Bo, I'm wondering if you can kind of going back. So I got my degree in basically exercise science too. And I've always thought, like, if I could do it over again, I would go into sort of that internship role, because I graduated, but I really didn't know too much. And I got into, the exercise, doing personal training and stuff. But I wish that I had gone more the direction that you had gone, find a mentor, find an internship. Can you talk a little bit about what that meant to you to have an internship, to kind of like, maybe not make that much money, but have the people there that were so experienced to shape your field?
Yeah, actually, in that process, a really influential person in my life was a tough old woman named Gay McNutt. She was the head softball coach at the University of Southern Mississippi.
That sounds like a softball coach name. I don't know.
Oh my God.
She was an All-American.
We're going to have to bleep that name.
She was a couple-time All-American at Texas A&M. She grew up in Texas, hard woman, tough woman, but a great mentor, leader. So the way we crossed paths was, I actually started out at Northwestern State, Louisiana. I was trying to abbreviate my story as much as I could. I went there for a semester, and when I got there, didn't really know what I wanted to do. It was a general studies major, and applied to an on-campus job. And they stuck me out the softball and baseball fields cutting grass, which I loved. And I could go cut grass all week, collect my beer money, go out on the weekends, go to school, give it a half-ass effort. Everything was great. And then when I met Coach McNutt, her and the baseball coach approached me, and they were looking for an equipment manager. And they were like, hey, we could take care of your schooling. We could give you, supplemental pay to help out with everything. And I was like, well, I'm already on an academic scholarship. My school's taken care of. And she said, well, we can cut you a check instead. I'm like, all right, that sounds good. So did that for a semester. Halfway through the semester, I was watching the teams go down into the weight room and asked the coaching staff, hey, do you mind if I go down and watch them and see what they're doing? And they welcomed me in there. I ended up meeting Thad Livingston, who was the head strength coach at the time. And just did a lot of observation hours. Well, when that semester ended, she took the head coaching job at Southern Miss. It was a little bit closer. My hometown was Baton Rouge, so Southern Miss is a couple hours away. At the time, Natchitoches was 3 hours away, so it got me a little closer. a little bit bigger school with a more expansive exercise phys department. And they had a cadaver lab, which I thought was cool at the time. We were the only school in Louisiana, Mississippi that had a cadaver lab. So I thought that would be a great opportunity there as well. And so I told her I'd be game to go. She asked me, gave me an invite. I said I'd be game to go if she could get my foot in the door with their strength and conditioning department. And she encouraged that if I was going to try to do that for a living, I needed to meet some strength coaches. I needed to stand in their shoes and see what they're doing, see what they're really going through, not just the glamorous side, but the hard side. How much effort it takes, how many hours it takes. You know, it's a service. She really hammered home to me that it's a service role. You're a service provider. And so the way she described it and the passion behind how she approached coaching really kind of got me interested. And she held up to her end. So as soon as we got to Hattiesburg, she got me a meeting set up with the strength and conditioning staff. They didn't know me from Adam, and kind of gave me the, hey, look, you can observe, stand in the corner. We'll talk to anybody. When we get done, you can help us clean up. We'll address any questions you have. We kind of started like that. And then eventually that grew into, hey, what do you know about barbell techniques? Hey, what do you know about machine techniques? Hey, you know, and so as my coursework expanded, so did my questions and my practical internships. So a couple of gentlemen that were there at the time, strength and conditioning staff, were terrific. And then some of my, at the time while I was an undergraduate intern, we had 2 graduate assistant students. One was a senior level grad assistant, and the other one was an entry level. They also, you know, played a huge role in kind of getting my feet wet and giving me an idea of what to expect over the next few years of gaining experience. And some of those people turned out to be some of the best professionals in North America that we've had today. Josh Stoner being one of them, who ran the program at the University of Missouri for several years. He's down in Texas now, working out of a private school. Melissa Moore, who's the assistant director at LSU. Brian Wiseman, who's the director of Olympic sports at Ole Miss. Charlie Dudley, who was the head strength coach, who's been all over the place and now is at a private. He's actually oversees a series of private high schools in Texas. So I just had some great people around that. Not only did they help me kind of get started, but they were on their way to kind of developing their careers as well. So what I translate that into now, when I speak to up and coming students, we have interns at the UFC. We have a ton that apply. I get a lot of direct messages through IG and Facebook and all that kind of stuff, asking like, what do I got to do to be sitting in your seat in 15 years? And one of the biggest things I tell them is like, it's kind of automatic. To get a lot of the accreditation, you've got to follow a degree program. That's kind of the automatic part. What's not automatic that they don't tell you is you need to accumulate as much practical experience as you can. And I put value into all levels of that. So whether it's personal training, or you're volunteering at a high school, or you do a internship at a university, however you can get it, you need to start building your portfolio, not only coaching, but being around coaching and understanding the ins and outs of coaching. Because whenever I interview someone, that's what I want to know, what they have experience with, whether they've done it directly themselves or they've been exposed to it around it. I'll dive into the depths of that, and that plays a huge role. When I get 2 applicants and their resumes look relatively close, I'm going to start diving into the practical experience, and whichever one has the most strengths or most diversity to bring to the table, they're going to add something to my program I have going on. So to me, that's a major strength. So I really advise people to get as much diverse practical experience as they can as they're cutting their teeth in this profession.
You don't just take the more jacked person automatically.
Yeah, I mean, hey, if someone takes care of themselves, it's always a plus. But yeah, I'm more interested in what's in between here.
No, that's very good. It sounds like, you know, I was kind of taking a few notes as you were talking about some of your influences, but you did mention that you got into a role where you're managing interns and assistants, and now you're doing, you know, you work with, you're answering questions and you go through employment in your current position as well. And I'm just curious, you know, like, I'm sure you've picked and chosen things over time from these people who have influenced you. And, you know, what would you say are some of the core things? Like, I think something you touched on is like that service role. I think that's pretty huge when you're in a position where you can impact a lot of individuals, or you have the you have the honor of working with high level athletes. It really is an honor, and so it is a service, you know, to them. So I was curious if, besides that, if there's other things that sort of drive your leadership style, whether you're working with interns, other employees, or also in terms of coaching athletes.
Well, I'll hit on the one you brought up first. When it comes to the service driven side, you have to enjoy that. You have to enjoy that you're a supplemental aspect that's playing just a tiny little slice of the overall pizza that they're diving into as a competitive athlete. And I love that. I love the fact that we do get to own just a little bit of influence that may go into an elite performance. We also have to appreciate that it is just a tiny bit of influence that goes into this overall big picture. With that, I think is you have to have an affinity to relationship building, because to deliver service, it starts with relationships. Some are, purely driven off of performance. The relationship is built off of, athlete A understands that you can provide them a service that's going to help them catapult their careers to the next level. It's that simple. Others won't let you get to that performance realm until they know you, until they trust you, they believe in you, they have faith in what you're driving. And usually those are the personalities. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to think about what their training consists of. They just want to know that that person's got their best interests at heart, and they're driving them in a path that is cohesive and it's cognizant around what the rest of the team is doing from a medical standpoint or a technical coaching standpoint. And then they just want to show up for their session. They'll give you everything they got, knowing that you're got their best interests at heart. And then when their session's done, they move on and they're going to their next practice or to the next responsibility they've got to take care of. So there's a couple different layers of how that relationship works. But either way, you've got to have an affinity to, one, identifying what that role is you're playing and what that relationship should look like in the eyes of the athlete or the coach. And then be ready to dive into that role, because ultimately my job is to influence performance, and I can't influence performance if they don't have the buy-in or the understanding that I'm a valuable piece to their big puzzle that they're chipping away at. So that's a really big one for me, and something that I would say I have a lot of conversations, not only with my full-time assistants, but students. And even, that's been a pretty common topic with podcasts and things like that, interviews with speaking with people, because there's not a lot of coursework around it. You kind of have to develop that in the practical realm. There's some decent books and things that you can read, but it involves a lot of intuition and instinct and understanding and feeling people out. It also takes a lot of patience. You have to have the willingness to want to go down that path. It might take 30 seconds. Sometimes it might take 3 years. But you have to have the willingness to want to go down that if you're truly going to be involved in influencing long-term performance.
Mm-hmm.
That's so funny. Sorry. Continue.
No.
What I was going to say is, sometimes a topic comes up and then you hear it multiple times within a short period of time. And recently I've had two people that I respect a lot say almost exactly the same thing as what you just said. And they basically, when you're coaching people, that they don't care what you know until they know you care.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. And
did I say that? Did I tell you that?
No, that wasn't you, Kelly, but I do respect you though.
No,
it reminds me of what you're talking about. Very much
true.
So.
And that level of care, again, that can be, they just want to know that you care about their performance. Some are deeper than that. They want you to know their family. They want you to know their background. They want you to know, and that's okay. But if they want to open that door, I'll walk through it with them. If they don't want to, we don't need to be at that depth. As long as I can get onto a platform where I can influence performance, that's my number one priority. The other thing that I would say in terms of principles or things that I think have stuck with me throughout this process is Charlie Dudley, who was the head strength coach at Southern Miss when I was there. He asked me early on, what's your long-term goal? What do you want to do? And like every other meathead that was, involved in those fields, I want to be a head strength coach for an NFL football team, 10 years from now. And he was like, why? And I was like, well, that's the thing, right? That's like that's the grandest thing you could do, right? And he was like, I think there's several avenues that you could go down, but you're already trying to specialize and you don't know anything. So you're already saying you're going to specialize as an NFL strength and conditioning coach, you've never been in the NFL, you've never been around it, you don't know how they operate. You've seen one Division I program, and that's it. And that really struck home to me. And what he ended up telling me is you need to spend the next 10 to 15 years of your life accumulating as much experience in as many different genres of sport as you can, because that's going to expose you to many different genres of coaching, many different personalities, many different strategies and technical styles. And what it's going to do is it's going to fill up your toolbox. Then one day when you have an opportunity to specialize in something, you're going to have an unbelievable amount of experience and tools to say, you know what, I'm prepared to take that thing on. And he's like, it may be something that is as regular as an NFL position these days, or it may be something unique. And for me, that really resonated. I held on to it forever. And it came to fruition whenever the opportunity with the UFC popped up. There's not a lot of roles in professional mixed martial arts. Even as many different leagues as there are. And so to be able to take that advice, accumulate all that experience, and I've worked with figure skaters and acrobatic athletes like gymnasts to combative athletes, wrestlers, boxers, fencers. I've worked with precision athletes, with pistol and rifle shooters and archers, endurance athletes with triathlon and marathon. Of course, the traditional team sports with, baseball, basketball, football, men's and women's lacrosse, a track and field for a long time, which is that one's near and dear to my heart, the sport of track and field. But, and what it ended up doing is when I got this opportunity to be able to get on the same level and dissect a sport like MMA from an energy systems perspective, from a weight cuttings perspective, from a concussions perspective, from an individual sport, which is very different. An individual athlete competitive mindset is very different from a team approach. It's just them at the end of the day. They don't have someone to rely on. They don't have a quarterback and a whole offensive line to rely on to do the other side of the job. It's just them. They control the offense and the defense the entire time that they're competing. So that takes a special understanding to be able to get on their level when it comes to the competitive nature around identifying objectives for training. And so all this stuff did exactly what Charlie told me it would do. It filled up my toolbox, and I felt confident when it came time to go in and compete for a position that was at the ground floor of a sport that was rarely studied. I think at the time there were like 20 total published papers internationally on this sport, where I was digging through track and field for the last 12 years of my career. And, there's a million papers. You can look up thousands of papers on each individual event in track and field. So to be on the ground floor, to have the confidence in the toolbox to be able to approach an outstanding team that they had accumulated from medical to nutrition and sports science, and collaborate and integrate on a level to where I could be a contributory role. I couldn't thank Charlie enough for giving me that piece of advice, and I've held on to that my entire career.
Yeah, that's huge. I was just editing a podcast, this other podcast that I do, a strength conditioning podcast for a company called Power Athlete, but they just had on a coach who was literally making the same point. He talked about his time coming up as a strength and conditioning coach and how he interpreted the pinnacle of success being a head NFL coach, and was basically reflecting the same sentiment that his mentor said to him, something very similar, which was, that's great. If at the end of the day, that's what you decide you want to do, so be it. But you need to arm yourself with all of these other tools and amass all of this experience and knowledge, because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what niches you might get into that you really like. So just because something is presented to you as the pinnacle of success, really think about what does that role really mean? And also think about your ability to influence at that level, right? Like your ability to influence, if you were, let's just say you were a strength coach or director of strength at like a small college or something like that, your ability to influence your touch points is actually like far greater. And so you just have to ask yourself why it is that you're pursuing this path, and then where can you have the most influence? And if at the end of the day, you still decide to be an NFL head coach, so be it. And it kind of reminds me a lot of what Lexi and I deal with in law enforcement, because when you get on, a lot of people have this mentality that, yeah, I'm going to be a patrol officer for X amount of time, and then my goal is to be a homicide detective. If detectives your jam, investigations, or I want to be on SWAT if tactics is your jam, whatever. And you think of these things, and then you have a tendency, you could potentially pigeonhole yourself from all of these incredible opportunities that Lexi and I have had the luxury of experiencing, because people have influenced us and said, look, don't put all your eggs in one basket, because you don't know what you don't know at this point, and you could really like sink your teeth into some really cool things and do it at a level where, with a certain amount of time on, there's not a huge amount of pressure and stress on you. You can kind of like tread water a little bit, if that makes sense.
Totally, totally. The other, performance side of that as well is like, hey, you want to work with football, at the highest level, they need endurance. What do you know about endurance? I was like, I mean, not a lot yet. Why not go spend time with triathletes or marathoners to see what does the peak of that side of the energy system look like? What does it look like? What does optimum in terms of endurance look like? Or go down the weightlifting path. What is peak wattage power output relative to someone's mass? What does that really look like on the far end? Because football players need power. And so when they broke that down, I was like, oh yeah, okay. So there is an extreme end to all these attributes that, say, a football player might need, and which came to be absolutely true with an MMA fighter. I mean, they're a jack of all trades, master of a couple, and but they have to have all of those things in their bank. They need to be able to tap into peak power and different levels of rate of force development, as well as there's an endurance component these days. Average fight times keep getting longer and longer. So it's, that little bit of advice, it has really been influential in a number of different levels. And, I don't know that I would reach the same level of success had I not latched onto that.
Well, I think that's great. And I think when I read your data analysis and your sports analysis of fighting, it's actually funny because when I was in university, I was in a kinesiology class that they wanted us to do a sports analysis. That was our big project. And it was a group project. And I told my group, I was like, I want to do MMA. This is back in like 2009. And they all said, no, that's way too complicated. So I really appreciate the research.
It might have saved you some headaches.
Yeah, I'm sure that it did. But I think that there's, with what Callie and I do, Callie is still doing a lot of our kind of physical fitness for law enforcement in our department. And when I was looking into it, I was looking for data of like, how long is a typical, like force encounter of an officer? What is the disparities between weights? Like I was just looking for data and there's really nothing. So it's a difficult kind of nut to crack in that sense, as far as like, how do you train for that? And how do you train for that moment where you have to, maybe take on somebody who's twice your size or anything like that, and might be on a substance that, you don't know. And it really kind of brought me back to the research that you've done and how you train your fighters. And I think that there's probably a lot of knowledge that you've gained over your long course of all the different things that you've described to us that might lend to some people that are listening to this that are in the profession of just, even if it's just getting in the gym, but maybe you have some insight into what you do for your fighters that might help us as officers when we do get into those encounters.
Yeah, I think, and this would go for any sport, any profession, any first responder, military, fire and rescue. I've done a little bit, some crossover with some PJs. We have an Air Force base pretty close by here. The first thing is assessment. Like what's the organism you have in front of you? So understanding, because I'm sure you guys got people coming out of the academy. They are all different shapes and sizes, probably different age groups. Different backgrounds, some athletic, some non, some come from a sporting background, some don't. Some may come from a combative background, some don't, but assessment first and understanding not just the physical qualities, but technical qualities as well, getting an understanding of their background. What other things have they done? If they're a rock climber, maybe that is going to have, it's going to service some of their job duties or tasks that they need to do for training. But once you have an assessment, you have a picture of at least where you're starting. Now you can get some general direction of where you're going based off what your curriculum is, based off of what the job demands are. And so what I try to really identify on first is what's the lowest hanging fruit? Like what are the biggest areas of weaknesses? And so you can do that pretty generally, generally speaking. What, how does their endurance compare? How is that? Can they sustain any sort of moderate level effort, for upwards of 10 to 15 minutes? What's that look like? Or down on the other end of the spectrum, a high force production effort, what does that look like, both from a exertion standpoint? What does peak power, peak force maybe look like in an instant? And then what's the average look like across 10 or 15 seconds? Get some understanding of their physical capabilities, because in things like law enforcement and first responders and military, their jobs are so diverse. They're a lot like fighters, meaning they need to be expert generalists. MMA fighters, everyone thinks like, oh, you got to be this world-class striker. It's like, you need to be a pretty damn good striker, but you also have to be a pretty damn good wrestler. You also have to know offensive and defensive wrestling. Then when you wrestle on a cage, that's a whole different skill set than wrestling in an open mat when a referee is going to stop you when you exit the circle. So, there are a lot of things that you just need to be generally familiar with, generally good at. And so from a physical standpoint, if you just chop off the low hanging fruit, first off, where are the biggest areas of weakness? Then over time, long term, you can chip away at some of the others that might be more specific to their job. But in first, because if I'm, tell me if I'm wrong, they get through the academy, they get through some basic level of training, you're on the job, right? So it's not like they get to warm up for 3 years and build their way through the ranks. Oh, now you're a full-time officer. Like, no, you get done with your basic training or whatever you got to do to get in the academy, and you're on the force. Hey, go get them, Jimmy. You walk out there day one, you're expected to do your job. So if you're going to prepare someone like that, I think you go after the low-hanging fruit first. What's going to help them survive and take on the onslaught of not just whatever they might encounter physically, but the rigors of the job, the long shifts, the frequent shifts, overnight shifts, things that have a weird demand on your physiology to begin with when you're flip-flopping back and forth between sleep cycles. So they need to be an expert generalist. Now, I kind of steal that phrase a little bit from a buddy of mine that's in Rochester, New York, named Greg Walsh. Greg runs a gym called Wolf Brigade. Private.
Yeah, I've heard of
But
it.
oh man,
Mace, they do a lot of mace work, right?
A lot of mace work, a lot of heavy kettlebell work. And when I first started conversing with Greg, one of the biggest things that I struggled with was that we were talking a lot about is how diversified our periodization concepts go in MMA. And then when talking to him, he's working with general public, and his general public may be comprised of some first responders. He's got librarians. He's got one guy that plays the violin professionally in the symphony. Like, they're all over the map. But all in all, in terms of their physical capabilities, they're all generalists. And so what his job is to do is to make them expert generalists. So when we broke down and take a look at all the fundamental movements that a generalist needs to be able to do, you need to be able to push, pull, hinge, squat, overhead press, crawl, breathe, brace. We kind of categorized all of these things. Then you look at these basic things and it's like, okay, I know subject A, B, and C can't do these two things. So in our programming, we're going to highly emphasize those things. And then, so that's kind of how he kind of goes about chopping away at his low hanging fruit. And some of the things that he's got going on in that gym are unbelievable. I mean, he has 130-pound females doing Turkish get-ups with 106-pound kettlebells. And that has to do with movement proficiency. It has to do with an understanding of body awareness. That's a very uncooperative object. That kettlebell does not want to go where you want it to go. And so for someone that small to keep that thing over their head and stand up with it, he's got some individual males over 50 years old that are doing 125-pound kettlebells for Turkish get-ups. They're swinging 170-pound kettlebells for multiple reps. He's got some that are deadlifting close to triple body weight. They're doing things that you would think elite athletes would be doing, but he's training them like expert generalists. And so this had a lot of carryover into a lot of the concepts that we're looking to have a fighter prepare year round for, because our fighters don't have a competition calendar. They don't have, it's not like a football season. Like, you go from September to December and then there's a championship in January. Your bouts aren't decided until usually 8 or 10 weeks out from the bout. Sometimes if you're an opportunist, you may have to jump on a bout that's 3 weeks away. They give you an offer. Hey man, we need to take you a short notice fight. It's in 3 weeks. And by the way, it's in Russia. And so now you got to deal with the time constraint. You got to deal with travel, all that stuff. And so this concept, I kept coming back to it, this concept of being an expert generalist, always being prepared, being within striking distance to start a fight camp, which resonates to me with law enforcement, first responders. It's like, you're not always looking for a peak performance, for an Olympic Games. You're trying to be at a relatively high performance all the time, a relative state of readiness all the time. And so the Wolf Brigade crew, they kind of have this approach year round. So I was able to adopt some pretty strong concepts from Greg and his team, and match them again with our scientific background and our approach of what we were doing with these professional fighters. And so, when you talk about like, how do you go about that process with someone like a police officer? I think first you start with assessment, then you go after low hanging fruit, but then you need to get them into a long-term regimen to where they're kind of at this relative state of readiness all the time. They don't get overly devoted to one aspect of training over another at any given time. It's a constant revolving door of impulse and exposure to different stimulus, ongoing. So then when that time comes, one, they're not totally overtrained because they've been exhausting all of their resources in one aspect of training. And they're generally prepared for just about anything when it's time to walk out the door, on their shift. So that's my 2 cents on that. That kind of stuff fascinates me. I could probably talk on that for the next 4 days, but I know we're limited on time. But yeah, I would definitely encourage checking out Greg and his crew at Wolf Brigade when it comes to those types of concepts. But regardless of the sport or the job role of the individual, I'm always going to lean on assessment first, understanding who that person is, what they're capable of, and then we'll follow some approach of training after that.
Yeah, I've heard Greg speak before. He's got a very primal approach. He's an interesting cat. He definitely is.
He is. Some people can get turned off quickly because of presentation or whatever. He grew up in hardcore bands. He was a BMX rider. He was a fighter himself, a Thai fighter, did some MMA, very good grappler. And those are just all extremist kind of activities. So but if you give him a chance to speak and you listen to his messages and you listen to the amount of assessment that has gone on to how they dissect training and how they've developed their training over the last 15 years, there's a lot of quality thought process behind it. It's not just a bunch of headbangers in a room that want to play loud music and throw iron around. They're very, very calculated in their approach. So yeah, I've been super fortunate for him to share as much as he's been willing to share with us at the PI.
Yeah, definitely a wealth of knowledge. One of the things that, everything that you're talking about falls very well into the framework with what we're trying to implement at our department. However, I would say that, there's a lot of similarities with not only the training aspect, but maybe sort of the structure of MMA, the organization itself, but there's a lot of like polar differences. And one of the things is, my background in working with athletes is like, you have people who are coming typically on their own volition to become experts of their craft. And I think, after assessment in terms of law enforcement, the first low hanging fruit outside of poor mechanics or injurious body movements or whatever is culture. Like, to get people, that lowest hanging fruit is just like getting them in through the door to like commit to that, like you said, being that in that constant state of readiness and doing what it takes to, to make their training a bit more well-rounded. Even if they are coming through the door, they have their bias towards a certain type of training, or they tend to embrace the things that they're good at. And I think we're all guilty of that to some degree. But so I think that is the lowest hanging fruit for us, is just that culture around wellness. And, I don't know if you have any advice, because you're typically working with like people who want to be there, but maybe you have some experience with that.
I'll surprise you.
No, good.
we actually don't. So for our fighters to access our resources, it's 100% voluntary. They're not mandated to, it's not in their contract. If they do, it is included in their contract. They don't have to pay extra for it. There's no cost to them. So in terms of medical coverage, S&C, nutrition. We feed athletes remotely. We feed them locally. We provide Oura rings for them. We just about everything under the sun we provide. There you go. We provide for them in terms of giving them the best approach towards training. Now, what you're talking about, to be able to, let's say they're coming under their own volition. They're not totally, that's not their thing. They don't voluntarily want to spend their free time sweating and suffering and going through these things to prepare for their job. What I go after first is, what are your performance goals? Like, what do you, as a professional, what do you want to do? Now, in my line of work, it's typically equated to more wins, more belts, things like that. Yours may be, I want to retire in 15 years, longevity, less injury on the job, like things along those lines. So those might be what you utilize to persuade them around training concepts, or provide them with a backbone of, this is why. And for us, it's a lot of the same thing. I get guys that they could care less if they ever put a barbell in their hands, but they want to put a belt in their hands. And so if you want to do that, okay, what do we need to do to best prepare you to evolve and advance your game? The other thing is, the fountain of youth, in my eyes, is learning new skills. You want to stay young. You want to constantly be challenging not only the physical side, but your intellectual side. So we fall in the same trap you're talking about. We have athletes that have a history of powerlifting. That's all they know. That's all they want to do is squat, bench, and dead. Sumo, maybe they're married to sumo deadlifts and gear supported bench press and whatever the case may be. Well, for evolution to happen, we have to change some things. And so we have that conversation. Like, if you want to evolve as an athlete, or if you want to evolve as a person to get better at your job, you're going to have to get exposed to some different things. Oh, and the byproduct is, it's actually going to stimulate some learning that is going to accommodate your youthfulness later on. So it's like, people are like, I turned 40 this year. I still don't feel like I'm 40. I feel great. I feel like I'm doing way better than my parents were when they were 40, but I don't stop. I'm constantly learning something, whether I'm learning how to pick the banjo or I'm learning how to swing a mace. I early on in my career, I cut my teeth weightlifting. So, we were snatch, clean and jerk, die hard. I was 2 and 3 sessions a day, every day of the week, getting abused. Went through that powerlifting phase, went through the CrossFit phase, went through, I just exposure. And what this led me down is, I want to try everything. I want to kind of, going back to that, be a jack of all trades, learn as many skills as you can. When I was working with Greco-Roman wrestling, a lot of the Greco influence comes from Europe. A lot of that European influence comes with kettlebells. So learning a lot of kettlebell strategies, not only just, long cycle swinging, but how to pick up a kettlebell that's body weight and a half. And then what can you do with that? Can you hoist it? Can you overhead it? Can you support it for 2 minutes at a time in a front rack position? So a lot of different ways to stimulate yourself with these different implements. And what that learning curve causes is continued adaptation. That continued adaptation, I believe, perpetuates itself in longevity. And so when you got someone that's like, I don't really like lifting weights or exercising, but my back hurts all the time. Okay, well, don't think of it as exercise. Let's think of it as, these are the things that are going to alleviate your back pain so you can go and do your job. And that'd be the same thing for, let's say you have something that's supremely physically fit. They're prepared to do their job, no problem, but they have zero combative experience. And there's a probably high probability that you're going to get into some sort of hand-to-hand confrontation with someone at some point. You probably need to spend some time evolving your game around grappling arts or wrestling, or things that involve a clinch, things that involve restraining someone or subduing someone gently, not killing them, but being able to apprehend them. And so that takes training. So does alleviating back pain. So does alleviating knee pain. So does increasing, midline stability in your torso, and being able to support gear. If you're a SWAT guy and you're carrying all this crap up all these different stairs and things, or you're a heavy artillery guy in the military and you got to carry all this crap in, now it's not just you being fit to carry yourself, you're carrying 80 pounds worth of crap in to do your job, and you do that routinely. Well, you can prepare for that. You can prepare to carry 80 pounds of crap. And so that's, I always, in those conversations, I make it sound like it's easy. When it comes to the approach in those conversations, the first thing I do is I validate what they do well. That might be one thing. And I might even have to bullshit them a little bit in validating something that ain't that great, but for them, in their world, maybe it is. The first thing I do is I validate the things they do well. Oh, you're married to sumo deadlifting. Dude, you do that really good, but we're going to continue to use that as an asset. But our world's not going to revolve around it. Then we get into that, usually feeds us into, or takes us down the path of the relationship, where so now that I've validated some of their stuff, we can start to have an educated debate on, here are the new things that we're going to influence you with. And then eventually that can lead us down a path of an agreement. Okay, now we've identified the things you do well. We've identified the things we want to utilize to evolve you a little bit. And now we're going to select what are those couple of things that we're going to start implementing right away. We come up with a short-term approach. We come up with a long-term approach. Those conversations structured that way are typically more productive than me just walking in and saying, forget everything you ever learned. We're going to do this for the next 3 weeks. And then if you're lucky, we might change the flavor after that 3 weeks. You know, you're right. There is a delicate side to developing a conversation, and that conversation turning into a very progressive action if you want to influence training and preparation long term.
Well, it goes back to what you're saying about relationships too.
And you're finding those hooks that will keep people interested. Like if you turn
Yes.
them off right away, and I mean, we've talked about that in previous conversations on our podcast, just even with suspects. Like if you're talking about something they don't care about, they're not going to, you know, engage with you. Or if you're talking about what you want to talk about, they're not going to engage with you. But if you find their hooks, you know, it's a slow process to bring them back to you. And, you know, I love that concept of the expert generalist. And I think it's so important for law enforcement. Like we kind of have so many things we have to be good at, but we have to be really good at so many things, you know? And I love that idea that, you know, you train to be good at pretty much a lot of things, you know, and it's a hard thing, but.
And if you really bust them down to their fundamental core, me and Greg talk about this all the time. A hinge is a hinge. Whether I'm swinging a kettlebell or doing an RDL or taking a clean off the floor, a hinge is a hinge. If you know how to hinge, you know how to hinge. You can learn how to do that with different implements. If you rotate, you know, I could rotate a baseball bat. I could rotate, you know, something to breach a door with. I can, you know, a rotation is a rotation. Bracing is bracing. I can brace holding something in front of me. I can brace holding something on my back. I can brace laying on top of something. I can brace something laying on top of me. Bracing is bracing. And so that's where you really get deep into the expert generalist. If you know those fundamental concepts and they're apparent and they are exemplified in everything that you do in training, the implement doesn't matter. The implement doesn't, you know, your body doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know if you're running on a treadmill or riding a bike. It knows energy demand. It doesn't know the difference between a barbell and a kettlebell. It knows resistance demand. It knows force production. That's it. And how you exemplify that, you can address it with very similar concepts from implement to implement, as long as you have that core philosophical approach around a squat is a squat, a hinge is a hinge. And so that concept of expert generalist in jobs and roles like that, it is 100% appropriate. Now you get into the very minute idiosyncrasies of a hammer thrower. That's a very specific skill. It is a very instantaneous skill. It is at a level of coordination, a level of speed and control over an external implement that, yeah, you can make the argument expert generalist year round might not be the correct approach for that event. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a police officer who is probably a parent, who is probably, you know, someone's dad, is someone's baseball coach on the side. He's also, you know, doing who knows how many shifts a week, sometimes overnight, sometimes during the day. He might be in a squad car. He might have a partner. He might not. He might have to run. He might be riding a bike. He might, you know, there's so many different avenues you guys go down to get ready for your job. So it is 100% appropriate for something like that.
Well, and I'm reminded how you're talking about a hinge is a hinge, and Callie has been doing a lot of training recently, and our coach, both of our coaches, has been relating some of the things like wrestling techniques of, you know, you lift somebody, it's basically like a clean. Think about it like that motion. And it clicks for her because she's an expert in that field, you know.
Did he tell you about this?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he did.
Yeah.
Okay. I was asking him, because when you get in a foot pursuit, there's not a lot of conversation about when you go to take that person down, what the plan is. So we were kind of working on that, Bo. And so when I was wrapping up this dummy to take him down, he was trying to convey a technique to me, and he just was like, look, just do it like a power clean, like a clean or whatever. And then it was like, that made sense. Sorry, Lex, but
Well, no, it just reminds me that everything goes back to those primal movements. And if you can get people educated in those, you can relate it to almost anything.
Yeah.
You know?
the concept,
You know,
not the skill itself.
Yeah.
like I said, in Greg's gym, I mean, he has individuals that have never done combatives ever, and he'll dabble around and get them to grapple a little bit, like in between. It's like at the end of some of their classes, they'll do a little 20-minute, 30-minute session. And he's like, dude, they know how to grapple, but that's just because they know how to do all these other things that we've already done. They know how to brace, they know how to clinch, they know how to squeeze, they know how to carry something in front. And so it just carries over really seamlessly, really easy, even though they don't know the sporting side or the technical side of grappling or wrestling, but they pick it up relatively quickly because they've been wrestling barbells and sandbags and medicine balls and kettlebells and maces for the last however many weeks. So a human being is just another implement.
Well, it's that concept over skill. You learn the concept first and then you refine the skill.
A friend of mine runs a 2A podcast here in Vegas, and he has a lot of congressmen, police officers, first responders, a lot from the MMA and fighting communities on there. And he had a couple gentlemen, I hope I don't butcher their name. One was Chad Lyman and
Yeah, Chad, that's
Alvarez,
correct.
what's his name? Ruben Alvarez. And I think Ruben's a police officer somewhere. Anyhow, they were talking about, they're both black belts in jiu-jitsu. They're talking about how they teach combatives. And, you know, one of the things that they pride themselves on is they don't teach techniques. They teach principles, like you're talking about, a takedown. There are principles of takedowns based on what the scenario is. Are we in open space? Are we in an alleyway? Are we up against a car? You know, where are we? That is going to govern our approach around takedowns. So then when they're teaching, they'll be like, okay, the takedown scenario is this day. And in this scenario, we're going to give you two options to walk away with that are going to be along these principles. And so because they've been through a lot of training with a lot of different professionals, especially non-police officers that maybe are black belts in something like jiu-jitsu, they come and try to teach officers grappling. It's like, all they know is the sporting side of grappling. Well, if you don't know the job of an officer, that makes it difficult to get very scenario specific. So they end up just teaching techniques. Well, they don't need just techniques. They need principles. So that they can make an educated decision when it comes time to take someone down based on what the context is, the scenario. I really love their approach and hearing how they dissected and broke it down. It made perfect sense. And I think it gave a lot of clarity to any listeners that might have been dialing in that come from a law enforcement background or a background where maybe you do private security detail or something along those lines. But yeah, I think that you're spot on. It's a principle driven thing that may lead you to a technique.
Mm-hmm.
You touched on earlier when you were talking about diving in a little bit more on the expert generalist. You were talking about how officers are also fathers or mothers, and they're people who just have normal lives outside of that aspect of their career. And it made me think too of fighters. And one of the things that we've talked with another guest in the past is just how sometimes when you have a violent encounter with a suspect, or you have, a situation where you have to use force, how that can affect you as an officer, how you walk away, and it can be pretty traumatizing. Even if it's, if it was a scuffle, or if it was levels of force beyond that, or lethal force. And it can be difficult. Those violent encounters are not a natural necessarily experience. And it made me think of the athletes that you work with and how they're all, they have their own personal lives. They're quiet individuals. Their personality is sometimes, I'm sure outside of the job is not a violent personality. They're, family men, family women, what have you. So I'm just kind of curious if you could shed some light on the types of personalities and maybe tie in some of the mental health aspects of what it's like to deal with these folks who go in and beat each other to shit and then kind of come out of that.
Yeah. You're spot on. I mean, from a personality standpoint, they come from all walks of life. Some that, like you mentioned, maybe they're single family household, have a wife, have kids. They just, at some point along the line, they got really good at fighting. That's how they make a living, and they're good at it, and they're competitive. They want to win at it. We have others that come from troubled backgrounds that led them down, maybe they were abused as a child, that led them down a path of self-defense, figured out they were pretty good at it, went back, beat up some of their old bullies, and then, started getting paid for it. We have some that grew up in the streets fighting, and we're a little bit more on the criminal side. And then, they got involved in a gym, and that kept them out of trouble. I have some that step in there and that are top 5 ranked, that are very, very good in the world, that hate fighting. They hate it. They're just super competitive, and they're really good at it. Like, this is the thing that I can compete and potentially win a world title at, but they're horrified when they go in there. They hate the feeling of it. They don't like hurting people.
That's fascinating to me.
But they know
Absolutely.
that their life's blood is competition, and they know that they can win at that. So they go in, they do what they got to do to win, and then they get out. And so from a mental health standpoint, I won't dive into too much. We have an awesome team of mental health professionals that help us with the fighters that we interact with. And we have a small remote network that will push fighters to seek professionals in their own areas and things. But for as far as my standpoint goes, there is some time that we spend with getting them focused in on training and off of the fighting scenario, especially if they're coming in after sparring rounds or after wrestling or coming right after a fight, to help them cope and distract. It's like, hey, let's forget about that part for a second. Let's just focus on you as a physical person. Let's get back to the physiology of it. And then when we're preparing for a fight, now let's get into those mindsets of what it's going to be like when that cage door shuts. Let's start thinking about those dark places that we do have to go to for you to be able to perform at an optimal level. So not only that you can score offensively, but so you can protect yourself. And so, you walk up and down that spectrum, but the biggest thing is understanding, I think, what your role is in their overall performance paradigm, because there's some that I'll never have that conversation with them in terms of what their mindset is in the cage. They have 3 other coaches or someone else in their corner that they walk that path with them. That's who they rely on. They rely on me for something else. And then I have others that are 100% transparent because they want me to be in that circle. They want me to understand what they're going through from a mental side. So it's totally up to them as to how far they let us in that doorway when it comes to the mental side of it. But eventually, when you get to know them long enough, they do vent. They vent and talk about it. And I would say one of the hardest things for them a lot of times is when they have to fight their friends. And in this game, as you climb the ranks, if you and your buddy are pretty good, it's inevitable. If you're in the same weight class, it's inevitable. At some point, you may have to compete against each other. And that's a very tough thing. That's a very difficult thing. Because it's a guy that you've trained with, or a girl that you've trained or sparred with for a long time. You've helped each other through your bumps and bruises. And now you got to subdue this person. You're going to get a $50,000 bonus if you can put this person down before time runs out. That's a very difficult concept, difficult thing. And the only thing I can relate close to that is that there are times when I'll have 2 fighters that I've spent an extensive amount of time with that will go and compete against each other. That gets difficult just to watch the fight, let alone prepare them for each other. And full disclosure, we tell them going into it, like, look, hey, you're matched up with this person. I happen to work with them remotely while I work with you locally. Are you okay with that? Do I need to pull one of my other staff members to take over the camp for this person? Or, do I step away totally? So we have a few different tactics we can use to kind of, manipulate the situation so we can still provide services, but not mess with the mental side of the game too much to where it's distracting them from an optimal performance. But yeah, that's a tricky side of it. There's no other sport like that where if you want to be offensively superior, you have to do damage. Well, someone has to take that damage. And so that's a tricky side of it for sure.
Oh God, I would absolutely equate that to law enforcement because, we come into the profession, the majority of us, like, we're there to protect the public, right? So we build this bond with the public. We build this idea of we are the protectors. And sometimes something happens where, you have to get into use of force, or you have to wrestle someone and you end up hurting that person that you were, you signed up to protect, or you signed up to, or even you developed a friendship with, and it's that mental barrier, like, geez, that sucks.
Yeah.
But it had to be done at some level, so I see a huge, equation. And I just think it's fascinating. There's so much research and so much like sports psychology, sports physiology that goes into training these high elite athletes. And I love to see where the kind of bleed in is to that we can take out of it, because we just don't get it,
Yeah, I think, and it's like anything, even MMA in the early, I mean, there were small pockets of professionals that were diving into these deep conversations that you're talking about. They were really trying to get the most out of preparation for what their job was. And I believe the same is true for law enforcement. It's just small little pockets. You just don't have a unified group across, globally that are agreed upon an approach to prepare police officers for, or first responder or whoever. And that's what it takes. It takes, you're starting a trickle effect. And I'm sure there's little pockets of people out there, just like Ruben Alvarez and his crew, little pockets of people that are starting to devise plans for more calculated approaches for preparation and training, and making that training a little bit more mandated, and making that training a little bit more of a necessity, not just a bonus. Like, if I want to be really good at my job, I could do that, but just to do my job, I don't necessarily need to do that. That language will start to shift over time, just like it has in fighting. 15 years ago in fighting, it was like strength and conditioning. I don't need to do that. I just want to show up and scrap. And so now that's like, you don't have a camp without strength and conditioning. You don't have a camp without going to see a PT once a week. Like, that doesn't exist now. So it is a slow trickle effect. Those little pockets, as long as they keep generating information and having crossover conversations with one another, so they'll start sharing information, and eventually it will grow and cultivate. But unfortunately, it takes time. I mean, it's the same way with us. We are definitely standing on a bigger pile of data than we were 4 years ago, standing on several thousand conversations that we've had since the beginning of that 4 years with other entities, other fight teams, other professionals that have kind of unified an approach to preparing fighters in a more professional way. And I believe it'll be a similar trickle effect in something like prepping for law enforcement, just the same way the UFC in 2017 decided to make a multi-million-dollar investment into athlete health and welfare. At some point, what does that look like from a government funding standpoint, or state funding standpoint, or, grant aid, or whatever the case may be, to where there's a bigger investment in it for first responders, law enforcement, you name it. Those little trickle effects just take time, but they get started by conversations and cross-pollinating, with people that are doing the same job, but in a different region, in a different area. And then slowly that spider web starts to come together. But yeah, it's a process.
Yeah. And it's exciting to be on like the precipice of it, to be an active part of it, not just like bitching about it,
Yeah. I mean, look, it's frustrating. Like, we have our bitch fest sessions the same way. But at the end of the day, if you want to make a difference, you want to be influential, it's an endurance trial. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So, you got to suck it up, gut it up, and then just chip away little by little. We have little victories every week. We have major defeats every month. But you just keep plugging away, and next thing you know, 365 days later, there's quite a bit of difference in terms of how you're operating and what you're getting away with compared to the year before. And that just gets exacerbated time after time after time. Your case studies start building up, your success stories start building up, your learning curves start getting smaller. Your big influential data pieces, like when you discover something, those start to become a part of the everyday language. That's like, now that's a necessity. We have to have that all the time. A vague example would be like beta alanine in fighting. Like, we know beta alanine helps to buffer lactate. So, but it's a chronic use supplement. Like, you can't reap the benefits until after 6 weeks or so of chronic use. So we beta alanine every fighter year round. Like, we never know when you're going to fight. We need to buffer lactate as part of our job. So we're going to do that year round. Well, 6 years ago, that wasn't a part of the daily language. It was like, oh, you're taking your multivitamin? Great. It wasn't like, dude, beta alanine twice a day, first thing in the morning, again at lunchtime, every day, no questions asked. So yeah, your little data points and things start accumulating over time, and they become part of the daily language.
Yes.
I love that. It just takes people to be willing to collect that data, and put it into it. Yeah.
And like I said, even when we started, we couldn't sit there on a pedestal and say, we're the UFC, we're the only people collecting data now. No, what we needed to do was go out and identify where those pockets were of people that were collecting data. Some had been doing it for 10 years already. They were just on a smaller platform, so their voice wasn't getting heard. And then now, because yes, we are on a bigger level of exposure and we have greater lines of communication, it's our job to go and do that. So, you know, as you build your spider web, you will encounter entities that have more firepower in terms of how they can converse and share information, leverage those. And, you know, those are the ones that help catapult things. But everyone just keeps on generating a ton of information in silos and it never gets unified. Then yeah, you're right. You will be spinning your wheels a little bit.
That's a huge takeaway for me from this conversation, like, and what I do with my job. So I'm excited because we do have really good contacts with people all around the world who've been doing data tracking with their, whatever their version of law enforcement stuff. And I really need to make sure I'm not just going through the motions with them, but I really need to dive into that. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah.
Now I'm pumped to
I tell you, a big one too is not everybody that's out there that's generating quality information is someone that you like. So you got to have conversations with people that you don't like, because they may have very valuable and maybe generous with that valuable information. It's going to contribute to your cause. We deal with knuckleheads. Oh yeah, we deal with knuckleheads all the time that have their hands on some fighter in some podunk town somewhere in the middle of nowhere, but that's the only resource they have, and they're generating good information. Well, I got to suck it up and have that conversation with this guy that I may not favor having a conversation with a couple of times a month, a couple of times a week, because the information is valuable. If we're gonna move the needle, we got to keep accumulating.
Yeah, that's a really good leadership point too. And just like kind of the bigger picture, you have to remember what the ultimate goal is and not let your ego get in the way of that situation. So yeah, good point for sure.
And I think that's been sort of a thread through what you've been talking about, is like not having ego when somebody tells you like, hey, your goal is to be a head coach of strength and conditioning for NFL team. Well, maybe that's not for you. You know, that takes a lot of humility to say, all right, well, what do I need to do? And it takes a lot of humility as a fighter to listen to a coach. It takes a lot of humility as an officer to realize that, hey, I might not be good in this other area. I'm really good in this area, but I'm not a generalist, you know? So I've heard what you've said throughout your career and throughout the people that you work with, is there is a certain amount of humility of like, maybe I don't like this person personally on a personal level, but I'm going to work with them because they can bring me some value in a different area. Mm-hmm. That takes a very strong character, and there's not everybody who is willing to do those things. So I think, you know, I commend you for that. And I think that everybody listening can get a good lesson from that, is just like, you know, take a step back, listen to what the feedback you're getting, and, you know, be open to other ideas.
Yeah. I mean, what you just said, it reminds me of something often, like coaching, leadership, mentoring, sharing, those kinds of things. That's not for everybody. Like, if you can't put your ego in your pocket, you're probably not going to be very good at those things. I mean, look at, in terms of leadership positions, look at some of the worst in those areas. If you look at head coaching, you look at politicians, you look at, you know, sheriffs, whatever, you know, you name it, parents. The ones that are unable to put their ego in their pocket, they typically are ice skating uphill most of the time, and that shit doesn't work out very well. You know, it really blocks your ability to learn. It blocks your ability to adapt. It blocks your ability to build relationships, to make friends, to make, you know, to be ultimate teammates with your spouse and things like that. Like, you can't do it if your motivation in life is just to be the king all the time like that. It's just really hard to be evolving and contributory in all those different spectrums of life. It's really difficult if you got this big shield of an ego up in front of you all the time.
Well, I think that's an awesome point to kind of like wind down on, unless there's anything else that you want to touch on that maybe we haven't talked about. Is there anything you wanted to mention?
No, I think just exploiting the fact that, man, what I do for a living and the personnel that I work with, there's a lot of heavy carryover in terms of who you guys encounter and who you deal with on a daily basis. So super fruitful to have this conversation with you guys. I love interacting with people that come from your world, both on the first responder side and the military side as well, because I do believe that we're on the horizon of greater and better methods around preparation for those job responsibilities and duties. And just like every other person on life, we want to live longer, we want to live healthier, we want to do our jobs with better of our ability. So when we finally get to retire or whatever, we still got some health left in us where we can actually have some fun and enjoy ourselves. But also do better by, our next generation, our kids, the people that we influence. So yeah, there's a lot of carryover in that. So really appreciate you guys letting me contribute to your conversation and bounce some ideas back and forth.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
And Bo, if people want to find you or follow you, what is the best way for them to do so?
Instagram, bo.sandoval, and then on Twitter, Oli Strength, OLY Strength. Those are two quick ones. Direct messages, or I'll get back to them. I usually get back pretty fast. If I am, I don't ignore anyone. I don't care what walk of life. That's like a mission in life. I will not ignore you. Sometimes I'm delayed, and it may take me a little bit depending on what I got going on, but I'll always answer. I've had some people be like, man, I sent you that message 3 weeks ago. I'm just glad you answered it. I'm like, man, I apologize. I'm sorry it took that long, but yeah, if you reach out, I'll definitely hit you up. But that's the two best ways, and feel free. Questions are always welcome. Love interacting with anyone. So shoot them my way.
Awesome. Thanks, Bo.